What would you describe, each of you, the political equation for Section 8? Is it something that has widespread support in the Congress? Is it something that is very dicey and depends on a few votes one way or the other?
Well, I would say that of the three major federal programs, public housing is the least popular. Recently I took a look at the figures for NYCHA, which administers
New York City Housing Authority,
as well as public housing, and NYCHA, the housing authority here, gets roughly about $750 of subsidy from Washington for each Section 8 unit, and about $450 for each public housing unit. So public housing, I think, suffers by comparison for a variety of policy wonky reasons. I won't get into unless you want to.
Well, we'll get into some of them, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to build on what Victor's saying, the public perceptions of public housing on a national and even on a city level tend to make it more of a target for budget cutting. But I think what's interesting, what we see at Habitat for Humanity, is many of our home buyers come out of public housing, and we see a great diversity in the kinds of jobs that people have who are in public housing, the kind of family structures. And so the stigma that you referred to that's associated with public housing, it's interesting because we see a real diversity in ethnic populations, in family size, in the occupations that people have. And so it doesn't, even though it can be a healthy political target, it can be more complicated than that.
Well, yeah, let's follow that thought for a second, because I'm sure you both know that for a while there, public housing projects were being blown up. Literally being blown up by the federal government, saying this is an experiment that failed and we've got to start from scratch. But you still see it as a cornerstone of...
Well, yes, if you look at large cities around the country, there are many in which public housing failed. Cities like St. Louis, yes, Chicago, enormous problems. Newark, our neighbor across the river, where demolition is the major form of treatment of public housing. But that's not true of New York City. We're exceptional in that regard. And I'll admit I'm a longtime admirer of our housing authority, so I have that bias, and they've managed over the decades to produce a very diverse income mix of residents compared to the concentrations of poverty that occurred elsewhere. I like to say that New York City is a city where you move to opportunity by getting into public housing, not moving out of it. And so I think the question for us is, how do we preserve what we have? The kind of opportunity that public housing represents here in face of underfunding from the federal government, and of course no funding, as you said, from state and local government.